The stage from Miles City came in an hour past noon, dust rising behind it like smoke from a grass fire, and Caleb Vance stood at the rail with his hat in his hands, the way a man stands at a funeral he is not certain he wants to attend. He had written 4 letters and received 4 in return, each one careful and correct, each one signed by a woman who called herself a seamstress and said she was accustomed to quiet work and small rooms. He had pictured someone slight and soft-spoken, a woman who would sit by the stove in the evenings with a needle and thread and ask him gentle questions about his day. He did not expect, when the door of the stage swung open, a woman who stepped down without waiting for a hand, who set her own trunk on the platform before the driver could reach it, and who looked at the town of Larch Hollow the way a buyer looks at a horse before deciding whether it is worth the asking price. If you have ever waited for a letter to become a person, you know that the waiting and the arriving are never quite the same thing, and I promise you, this story is worth staying for until its end. Her name was Adelaide Reeves, and she told him so before he could ask, her voice even and unhurried, her eyes moving once over his face and once over the ranch wagon behind him, as though she were reading 2 different documents and comparing their sums. Caleb had built his life on practical things. He ran cattle on land his father had proved up 20 years before. He mended his own fences. He kept his ledgers in a hand that other men called too careful for a rancher, and he had buried a wife 3 winters back who had died of a fever the doctor never named plainly. He did not need romance. He needed a partner who would not flinch at the size of the work, and he had believed, reading her letters through the long autumn evenings, that a seamstress would understand small stitches and patient hours in a way that would serve a quiet household well enough. He did not understand, standing at that rail with his hat in his hands, that the woman before him had spent more days of her life on horseback than at any sewing table, and that the calm in her eyes was not the calm of a woman entering a new life, but the calm of a woman who had already survived one. The wagon ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and in all that time she asked him only 3 questions, each one plain and useful, about the number of hands he kept, the size of his herd, and whether the well ever ran short in late summer. He answered her honestly, the way he answered every question, and he found himself watching her hands where they rested in her lap, noticing that they were not the hands he expected, the skin roughened at the knuckles, a thin white scar crossing one palm, the way a rope burn crosses a palm, not the mark of a needle. He said nothing of it. A man learns, working land that does not forgive carelessness, to notice a thing and set it aside until it asks to be understood, and so he set it aside and drove on toward the house he had built with his own hands, a plain 2-story place with a porch that faced west so a man could watch the weather coming for a full day before it arrived. When they came over the last rise and the house showed itself against the falling light, she did not say it was fine or that she was grateful, or any of the soft words he might have expected from a woman arriving at the end of a long journey to marry a stranger. She only looked at it for a long moment, the way she had looked at the town, and said, "That roof will need attention before the snow comes." He laughed, surprised into it, the first real laugh he had allowed himself in, longer than he could easily say, and she looked at him as though she had not intended to be amusing, which somehow made the laugh come again. That evening, after the small ceremony that the circuit preacher performed on his way through in less time than it takes to shoe a horse, after the supper of beans and cornbread that she cooked without complaint, though the stove was unfamiliar and the wood too green, Caleb sat on the porch and watched her unpack her trunk through the lit window, and he saw her set aside a small basket of needles and thread, plain and orderly, exactly the kind of thing a seamstress would carry. But beneath it, folded at the bottom of the trunk where the lamp barely reached, he saw the corner of something heavier, canvas-colored, the kind of coat a man wears in open country rather than a woman in a sitting room, and he saw her hand pause over it before she covered it again with a shawl. Quickly, the way a person covers a thing they are not ready to explain. He did not ask. He told himself there would be time enough for explanations, that a new wife was entitled to keep a few corners of herself private in the first weeks of a marriage built on paper and patience rather than courtship. And he went to bed that night thinking less of the coat than he ought to have, and more of the quiet, competent way she had moved through his kitchen, as though she had done such work before in some other, harder version of a life she had not yet described to him. The first weeks passed the way early winter passes in that country, with the cold coming down out of the north in patient stages, each morning a little sharper than the one before, the grass turning the color of old rope, the cattle beginning to bunch closer along the creek bottoms where the wind could not find them so easily. Caleb watched his new wife settle into the rhythms of the house, with an efficiency that surprised him daily, though he was careful never to say so aloud, believing a compliment offered too often might come to sound like suspicion. She rose before he did, kept the stove going, mended what needed mending, and her stitches, when he finally saw them close on a torn shirt or a worn harness strap, were not delicate at all but strong, doubled, the kind of stitch a man puts into gear that has to hold under weight. He noticed this the way he noticed most things, quietly, and filed it beside the coat in the trunk, another small fact waiting for its explanation. It was the horse that told him more than the stitches ever could. He kept a gelding, a big rangy sorrel named Duster, that no one on the place could handle easily, a horse his last hand had called more trouble than the wages were worth. And one gray morning Caleb came around the barn to find Adelaide standing in the corral with the animal, not approaching it, not speaking to it in the high, foolish voice some women used on frightened creatures, but simply standing, her weight settled low, her hands loose at her sides, letting the horse come to her instead of going to the horse. Duster came. He came slow, ears working, and then he put his nose down into her open palm the way he had never done for any man on the place, and Caleb stood at the corner of the barn and watched his wife gentle the meanest horse in his string without a word of instruction from anyone, and he understood, standing there in the cold with his breath fogging in front of him, that he had married a woman who was not entirely who her letters had described. He did not confront her. That was not his way, and it was not yet his right, he told himself, since he had married her on the strength of paper promises and had made a few of his own that were not entirely complete either, keeping from her, in those early letters, the fact that his first wife's death had left him owing money to a bank in Miles City that he was still working to pay down, a fact he considered his own business until trust had grown enough to bear the weight of it. Instead, he began, in small ways, to test the edges of what she knew. He asked her opinion on which pears to cull before the drive to the rail yard in spring, expecting her to defer to him, and she answered instead with an assessment so precise, naming which cows carried weight poorly and which steers would not hold flesh, through a hard winter that he found himself following her advice without quite deciding to. He asked her to help him figure the tally in the ledger one evening when his eyes were tired from the lamp, and she corrected 2 errors before he had finished reading the column aloud, her pencil moving with the same unhurried certainty her hands had shown with the horse. Neighbors began to notice too. Otis Pruitt, who ran the spread 2 miles east and considered himself an authority on every marriage in the county, whether asked or not, rode over one afternoon under the excuse of borrowing a plow bolt, and stayed an hour longer than any bolt required, watching Adelaide split kindling with an economy of motion that made his own woodpile look like the work of an amateur. He said nothing to her directly, but on his way out he paused beside Caleb at the gate and said, in the dry, unhurried way he said most things, "That's a peculiar kind of seamstress you found yourself, Vance." And Caleb said only that she sewed a fine stitch, which was true, and left the rest unsaid, which was also, he was beginning to understand, becoming a habit between them both. In the evenings after the work was done, they had begun to talk in the way people talk when the silence between them has grown comfortable enough to risk a few real words. She asked him about his first wife once, plainly, the way she asked everything, and he told her the truth in short sentences, the fever, the doctor who came too late, the long winter after when the house had felt too large for one man to fill. She listened without offering comfort she did not feel entitled to give, and when he finished, she said only, "That explains the empty room upstairs." And he said, "It does." And neither of them said more, but something in the quality of the quiet that followed felt different from the quiet that had come before, less like two strangers occupying the same rooms, and more like two people beginning, carefully, to occupy the same life. He still had not asked about the coat in the trunk. He still had not asked why a seamstress could gentle a wild horse, or correct a ledger, or judge cattle with the eye of a man who had spent a lifetime among them. But he found that he was in less hurry to ask than he had been in the first week. Not because the question had stopped mattering, but because he had begun to trust that whatever answer she was keeping folded beneath that shawl, she would give it to him when the time was right, and he had decided, somewhere in those quiet evenings, that he was willing to wait for it. The way a man waits out a hard winter, certain that spring, however delayed, is still coming. The letter came in the last week of February, carried out from town by a rider who said only that it had been left at the general store by a man asking directions to the Vance place, and would not say more than that when Caleb pressed him, being, as most riders in that country were, disinclined to carry gossip further than the distance strictly required. Caleb did not open it. It was addressed to Adelaide Reeves, not Adelaide Vance, in a hand that was cramped and hurried, and he set it on the kitchen table where she would find it when she came in from the henhouse, and he watched, without meaning to watch so closely, the way her face changed when she read the name on the front, before she had even broken the seal. She did not open it in front of him. She folded it once and set it inside her apron, and went on with the business of supper as though nothing in the room had shifted. But Caleb had learned by then to read the small changes in her, the particular stillness that came over her hands when something troubled her enough to hide it. And he saw that stillness now and said nothing, because he had promised himself patience. But he lay awake that night listening to her breathing beside him, too even to be true sleep. And he understood that whatever was folded in that letter had come from the same hidden place as the coat in the trunk. Word came a few days later that a man had been asking after her in town by a name that was not quite her own. Addie Colton, the storekeeper's wife, reported to anyone who would listen, a name close enough to be no accident and far enough to be deniable, and that the man had described her in detail down to the scar on her palm, which the storekeeper's wife found deliciously strange to repeat, though she had no more idea what it meant than anyone else in Larch Hollow. Otis Pruitt, riding over again under some fresh pretext, mentioned it to Caleb at the gate the way he mentioned most things, without malice but without much delicacy either, saying only, "Folks do talk, Vance, and a man in your position might want to know what he's got standing in his kitchen before the whole county decides they know it better than he does." Caleb did not answer that the way Otis perhaps expected. He said, "She'll tell me when she's ready," and Otis looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was, for Otis, unusually close to respect, and said, "That's either the wisest thing I've heard from you or the most foolish," and rode off without saying which he believed it to be. But the pressure did not stay confined to gossip for long. 10 days after the letter came, a man rode up to the house directly, a broad, well-dressed man on a good horse, the kind of man whose boots had never known a full day's work in a corral, and he introduced himself to Caleb at the porch steps as Silas Cobb, a cattle broker out of the territorial capital, and said he had come about a matter of business concerning the woman Caleb had married, a matter, he said, of an old debt her father had left unpaid before his death, a debt that had passed by law and by custom in that part of the country to whoever stood to inherit what little the father had left behind, which in this case, Cobb said, with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, appeared to be nothing but a daughter with a talent for disappearing. Caleb did not invite him in. He stood on the porch with his arms folded and asked what exactly the debt concerned. And Cobb explained with the patience of a man who had told the story many times and enjoyed the telling, that Adelaide's father had run cattle on borrowed money and borrowed time in equal measure, that he had died owing Cobb a sum large enough to matter, and that Cobb had spent the better part of a year tracing the daughter who had vanished from the funeral before the debt could be settled. A daughter who had, he understood, been offering herself to lonely ranchers under an assumed simplicity, calling herself a seamstress when in fact she had been raised in a saddle and trained to judge cattle before she could properly write her letters. He said this last part with a particular relish, watching Caleb's face for the reaction he expected, and Caleb gave him none, though something cold had settled behind his ribs that had nothing to do with the weather. He told Cobb to wait and went inside, and found Adelaide standing just past the kitchen door, where she had clearly been listening to every word, her face pale but her spine straight, and he asked her only one question, "Is it true?" And she answered, "All of it," and offered nothing further, waiting, the way a person waits for a verdict they believe they deserve, but hope to be spared. She told him the rest that night after Cobb had ridden off toward town, promising to return within the week for his answer, and she told it plainly, without asking for pity, the way she told most things. Her father had been a drover his whole life, a man who could read a herd the way other men read scripture, but a man who could not resist a bad wager or a worse partner, and by the time the fever took him 2 winters back, he had left behind more debt than land, most of it owed to Silas Cobb, who had fronted him money against a herd that never materialized in the numbers promised. She had been raised on horseback, had worked her father's cattle since she was old enough to sit a saddle, and had learned, in the process, everything a ranch wife might need to know and a good deal more besides. But she had also learned in the hard months after his death that a woman alone with a dead man's debts and a reputation for having run cattle like a man was not a woman anyone respectable wished to marry, and that a woman who called herself a seamstress, soft-spoken and small-skilled, was a woman men wrote to eagerly, offering safety in exchange for a life she was fully capable of living but had been made to feel unworthy of admitting to. She had answered Caleb's advertisement, she said, not out of deception exactly, but out of a hope that if she could reach a good man's house under a gentler name, she might build something true before anyone required her to explain the rest. "I meant to tell you," she said, "when it seemed safe to tell you, and Caleb, who had spent the evening turning the coat in the trunk and the horse in the corral and the ledger in the lamplight all over in his mind, said only, it was safe from the first week, and she had no answer for that, because she understood it was true. And the understanding cost her more than the confession had. He did not send her away, and he did not go to town to settle Cobb's claim quietly, the way a lesser man might, believing the shame of it could be paid off and buried. Instead, he told her, in the plain way he told most things, that a debt owed by a dead man to a living broker was not a debt she carried into this house, and that whatever Cobb believed the law allowed him, he would find no easy purchase on a ranch where the woman in question had a husband willing to stand at the gate beside her. But the standing at the gate proved harder than either of them expected, because Cobb, denied his easy collection, did not simply ride away. He rode instead to the bank in Miles City that held the note on Caleb's own herd, the debt from the fever winter that Caleb had never fully disclosed, and he bought the paper outright, quietly, the way a man buys leverage rather than cattle, and within the week Caleb received notice that the note would be called due in full the moment the spring drive reached the rail yard, an impossible demand unless the full herd arrived intact, and sold at top price, a demand clearly designed to fail, because a man who could not pay would forfeit the herd entirely, and a man who forfeited the herd entirely would have nothing left to offer a wife but an empty house and an emptier future. It was, Caleb understood, sitting at his own kitchen table with the notice in his hand, not simply a demand for money. It was Cobb's way of ensuring that if he could not claim the daughter's debt directly, he would claim it through the husband instead, and ruin them both in the process, and take satisfaction, Caleb suspected, in proving that a woman who lied about her name had brought ruin down on a decent man's head. Adelaide read the notice over his shoulder and said nothing for a long while, and then she said, "We drive early, before the thaw fully sets the trails soft, and we drive the whole herd, not the culls, the whole herd, and we get there before he can find another way to stop us." Caleb looked at her and saw not the seamstress he had expected off that stage in autumn, and not quite the frightened woman who had confessed her father's debts the night before, but something closer to the drover's daughter she had always been underneath both of those, steady, calculating, already turning the problem over, the way she had turned over the tally in his ledger, looking for the column that did not yet balance. "We'll need every hand we can hire," she said, "and I'll ride point, not because you need to be told I can, but because you already know I can, and there's no more sense in either of us pretending otherwise." Caleb said, "No, there is not," and something in the saying of it, plain as it was, felt to both of them like the truest vow either had spoken since the circuit preacher's brief ceremony months before. They pushed the herd north toward the rail yard in the first week of March, earlier than any sensible drover would choose, with the ground still hard in the mornings and treacherous with thaw by afternoon. 6 hired hands, and Caleb and Adelaide moving 400 head of cattle across open country that gave a man no shelter and very little mercy. She rode point the first 3 days without a single hand questioning it, because within an hour of the drive's start, she had turned a bunch quitting the herd at a creek crossing with the economy of movement none of the hired men could match. And after that, her place at the front went unspoken and unchallenged. Caleb watched her from the flank some afternoons, small against the gray country, reading the herd's mood the way she had once read his ledger, and he understood that whatever fear had driven her to call herself a seamstress, it had never once matched the truth of what she was capable of, and he found himself grateful, in a way he had not expected to be grateful, that Cobb's cruelty had forced the truth into daylight sooner than either of them might otherwise have chosen. The blizzard came on the 4th day, the way bad weather in that country always seemed to come, without patience for anyone's plans, a gray line building low on the northern horizon that Adelaide noticed a full hour before any of the hired men thought to mention it, and she rode back to Caleb at a gallop that scattered gravel, and said only, "We lose the herd unless we bed them now, in the coulee 2 miles east, not the flat," and he did not question her, because by then questioning her had become the slower path to being right. They drove the herd hard into the coulee as the first flakes came sideways on a wind that seemed to have teeth in it, and within the hour the world had gone entirely white, the kind of storm that swallowed sound as thoroughly as sight. And 2 of the hired hands, young men new to the country, lost their bearings within 100 yards of the herd and would have frozen in the drifts had Adelaide not gone out after them with a length of rope tied from her saddle horn to a fence post at the coulee's edge. The same method, she told Caleb later, her father had taught her as a girl for finding the barn in a whiteout, a method no seamstress would ever have needed to learn. She brought them in half frozen but alive, and then she turned her attention to the herd itself, which had begun, in its animal panic, to drift with the wind toward a frozen creek bed that would not hold their weight. And it was Adelaide who organized the remaining hands into a moving wall of horses and slickers to turn the leaders back into the coolie's shelter, her voice carrying over the wind in short, plain commands. that no man on that drive, including her own husband, thought to argue with. Caleb himself went down once, his horse stumbling in a drift deep enough to hide a fence post, and it was Adelaide who found him in the white blindness by following the rope she had strung earlier, hauling him upright with a strength that surprised him, even after everything he had already learned about her, and said only, "Not yet, not out here," which was, he understood later, the truest declaration of love either of them had spoken in the whole of their short marriage. The storm held through the night and broke toward dawn the way such storms often did, suddenly and without ceremony, the wind dying to nothing and the sky clearing to a hard, brilliant blue over a country buried in 3 feet of new snow. And when the light came up fully, they counted the herd and found they had lost 11 head to the drift and the cold, a loss any drover would call fortunate given the storm's teeth, a loss that would still leave them enough cattle at the rail yard to satisfy even Cobb's impossible demand, provided the prices held and the trail ahead stayed clear. It was Otis Pruitt, of all people, who met them 2 days later on the last approach to the rail yard, having ridden out from Larch Hollow with news that could not wait for a letter, saying that Cobb had overreached in buying up Caleb's note, borrowing heavily himself to do it, and that word had reached the bank's owners of exactly how the debt had been maneuvered, prompting a quiet but firm suggestion from men with more authority than Cobb that he settle for the note's original terms or answer for the manner of its purchase, a suggestion Cobb had apparently decided, on reflection, made discretion the wiser course. Caleb listened to this news standing beside his wife in the trampled snow, at the edge of 400 head of cattle that both of them had nearly died keeping alive, and he found that the relief of it landed smaller than he expected, dwarfed as it was by the plainer, larger fact that she had ridden into a blizzard to save his herd, his hands, and finally himself, without a moment's hesitation about which parts of her true self she was finally, fully allowed to show. They sold the herd at the rail yard 3 days later at a price better than Caleb had dared to hope, given the lateness of the season and the hard winter behind them, enough to clear the note Cobb had bought and hold back a fair sum besides. And Cobb himself did not appear to collect on anything, having apparently decided that a debt so publicly and expensively mishandled was better left uncollected than pursued into further scrutiny. Caleb never saw the man again, though he heard some years later that Cobb had left the territory altogether after a run of bad dealings finally caught up with him in a town further north, news he received with no particular satisfaction and no particular regret, the way a man receives news of weather that has already passed him by. The ride home from the rail yard took 4 days, easier now with empty saddlebags instead of a herd to mind, and on the second evening, camped beside a creek finally running free of ice, Adelaide took the canvas coat from her saddle roll, the same coat that had once lain hidden at the bottom of a trunk beneath a shawl, and she wore it openly against the evening chill, and Caleb, watching her across the small fire, understood that this was as close to a vow as either of them was likely to speak aloud. The plain fact of a hidden thing worn openly at last. They reached the ranch on a clear afternoon, with the last of the snow melting off the south-facing slopes in dark, wet patches, and the house stood waiting for them the way it had stood on the evening she arrived off the stage, a plain 2-story place with a porch facing west, though it looked different to Caleb now, fuller somehow, less like a house built by one man alone and more like a house that had finally been proved up in the way land is proved up, by use, by weather survived, by work shared rather than merely witnessed. Otis Pruitt rode over within the week, under no pretext at all this time, and sat on the porch step with a cup of coffee Adelaide handed him without being asked. And he looked at the two of them for a long moment before saying, in his dry, unhurried way, that he supposed Larch Hollow had gained itself the finest drover in 3 counties and lost, in the same transaction, its most interesting piece of gossip, and Adelaide said only, "I expect the gossip will find something else to feed on before long," and Otis allowed that it generally did. And the three of them sat in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it at all. That winter, the second of their marriage, Caleb built a new corral fence closer to the house, at Adelaide's suggestion, so the horses could be watched from the kitchen window on the coldest mornings, and in the evenings when the work was done and the lamp was lit. She still kept her small basket of needles and thread on the table beside the stove, still mended his shirts and doubled her stitches through harness leather when it needed strengthening, because it turned out in the end that she had never entirely lied about being a seamstress, only about the whole of what her hands were capable of, and Caleb had come to understand that the truest marriages were built exactly that way, not on the absence of hidden things, but on the slow, patient uncovering of them, one season at a time, until nothing remained folded at the bottom of any trunk that either of them still felt the need to hide. He kept the coat, when she was not wearing it, hung on a peg by the back door instead of buried away, and visitors to the house sometimes asked about it, a canvas drover's coat hanging incongruously beside a woman's shawl, and Caleb, when asked, answered only that it belonged to his wife, which was true, and left the rest for her to tell when and if she chose, because he had learned in the space of one hard winter and one harder blizzard that some truths were worth waiting for, and that the waiting itself, patient and unhurried as the country around them, had become its own quiet kind of proof that what they had built together was, at last, entirely and lastingly real.